Hello! In this video, we will demonstrate how teachers can use a framework to analyze a technology-based task. In particular, we'll be using the framework developed by Sherman and Caton, in which they identified 3 goals a teacher might have for using technology to teach mathematics. In particular, a teacher might be interested in having students make mathematically meaningful observations, or look for invariant relationships. They might want students to engage in mathematical explorations and use appropriate tools strategically. Or they might wish for students to make and test conjectures, modify their thinking, and foster curiosity. Once a teacher has determined the goals that he or she has for using technology, it's important to consider how they are aligned with the technology they've selected. So for example, if the teacher wants students to make mathematically meaningful observations, then it's important that the technology allows tools for students to do so. Similarly for exploration and making and testing conjectures. Once the teacher has determined if the technology is aligned with his or her goals, then it's important to consider the technology features and whether they support the goals the teacher wants to achieve. So for example, a question that a teacher might ask is to think about whether the technology that is used, if it's used as an amplifier or as a reorganizer. And also think about the ways that it can support students in making observations, exploring, and creating and testing conjectures. Let's consider an example. We're going to be looking at a task called Mellow, Yellow. In this task, the goal is for students to describe how different motions, such as stopping, walking slowly or quickly, or changing directions, are represented on a graph, and vice versa. What we'll determine is how we can use the framework to analyze this particular technology-based task. So this task is aligned with the goal of making meaningful observations. We want students to notice some relationships between the graph and the motion that Mellow Yellow carries out as he's walking from home to the store. We also want students to modify their thinking. So it's possible that students will think that a particular graphical representation is aligned or correlated with a particular movement. That may or may not be correct. Once they get feedback from the technology, they might modify their thinking about the relationship between the graph and the movement. So the features of the technology that we're looking for is we want to make sure that what the technology is doing is different from what we could be doing with paper and pencil, and also want to make sure that the technology is providing students with the feedback they need to modify their thinking and to make observations. So let's take a look at this particular task in action. So the first thing that the students are asked is, what story does the graph tell? So looking at the graph, we can see that Mellow Yellow, who's represented here, is starting at home, walking a particular distance in 5 minutes, and then from minutes 5 to 10, it appears they aren't increasing their distance at all. And then we see that they're walking some more distance in the next 2 to 3 minutes. We notice that the rate at which they're walking is different in time 0 to 5 and time 10 to about 12 or 13. So we can check that. We can get some feedback from the technology and see how our story that we created from the graph matches with what was anticipated. So we see our story says Mellow Yellow decided to walk to the corner store, which is less than a mile away. She got about halfway there and stopped to rest a while, and then started walking again, but faster than before, to make up for lost time. While my story is very similar to this one, I see that the description is a bit more precise, indicating how far Mellow Yellow is walking, and also indicating when Mellow Yellow chose to stop. So this feedback that I'm provided will give me some information about how I might create my next story in the next task. So the technology in this case really isn't doing anything different than what might be done with paper and pencil. A teacher could provide the same task in paper, provide students with the answer key, and they can check their story against that represented in the answer key. So in this case, the technology use in this particular portion of the task doesn't seem any different as what might be done with paper and pencil. However, what is different is that next what I can do is press the button Go, and we can watch Mellow Yellow walk according to the graph over the time that's provided. It won't be in actual minutes. Let's see what happens. So Mellow is walking, and we see that at time 5 minutes, he stops for a bit and rests, and then he continues walking to the corner store, but this time more quickly. So in this case, the student is getting a connection between the graphical representation, the verbal description of the story, and a simulation of the actual walk that occurs. In this way, the technology is used to do more than what could be done with paper and pencil by providing the link between the different representations in this particular task.